Welcome to Audience of One podcast. We hope the stories and testimonies shared by a range of Christian leaders inspire and encourage you to live for an audience of one in every season of life. And if you do not yet have a relationship with God, we hope that these conversations offer meaningful insight into the lives of those who follow Christ. This is Audience of One.
On this episode, we hear from Karl Faase. Karl is a well-known Australian Christian communicator. He is the CEO of Christian media company Olive Tree Media, and they have created content like Faith Runs Deep and Jesus the Game Changer. He is also currently widely known as the presenter of the daily nudge spots, which are heard on radio all over the country. So, Karl, thanks for joining us. You're used to being on the other side of the microphone, but you're in the hot seat today. Thanks for joining us.
Yeah, I'm feeling very relaxed. Not. It's good to be with you and Regan and Mark. It's great to chat to you.
Yeah, we definitely appreciate having you on. Just the first question, what was life like growing up?
Oh, well, my early years are pretty interesting, actually, because my first 8 years were in a thriving metropolis called Tambar Springs. And even people in New South Wales have never heard of Tambar Springs. Tambar Springs is about 100 kilometres south and maybe a little bit east of Gunnedah. And Gunnedah is in kind of the northwest of New South Wales. After that, and we can tell a bit more of that story later about why this move happened. But then I moved at 8 years old. My family moved to Armidale. And the reason we moved to Armidale is my dad and mum agreed to, or decided to, felt called by God to, run a children's home. So this was a great big house which had 20, a revolving door of about 18 to 20 kids. Some were wards of the state. Some were left there by their families that couldn't look after them. So I grew up with a household of 20 children, 18 of which were not related to me in any way, shape or form. Some were there for many years. Some were there for just a few months. And so that was kind of my earliest years. I would say that the one other thing I would add there is that education was lost on me. So I wasted my high school years, and it was a pretty interesting time. And I think, growing up in a household where my parents are totally distracted by a whole bunch of kids, and just not really connecting with the whole school teaching scene. So yeah, that was my focus at school was to join any sporting team that had a trip away. And I remember going away in the hockey team. I basically borrowed a stick, turned up at training, and there I was in the hockey team. And off I went to the next tournament in another town nearby. So that was my earliest years.
Nice. Did everyone just jump in the bus on the way to church on Sunday mornings, or how did that work out?
Pretty much, I mean, we had a minibus, and that's what we carted all the kids around with. In fact, we used to go to the St. Peter's Cathedral in Armidale, and the whole crew would turn up to St. Peter's Cathedral. So that was my kind of first church. Well, not my first church experience. My first church experience under the age of 8 was at a little place called St. Mark's, Tambar Springs. And there's quite an interesting story around St. Mark's, Tambar Springs. The ex-Deputy Prime Minister of Australia, John Anderson, who's quite well known for John Anderson conversations, and John Anderson and I, if we're in a same meeting together, he will often say, Karl Faase and I came from the same church, because his farm, his family farm, Newstead, is just down the road from Tambar Springs. And this little church was where when he came back to faith after university years and went back to the farm, he used to go to that church. And interesting, I was just talking to John on the phone the other day, and he and his wife Julia told me that they've actually just closed the church, which is pretty sad, really. That unique space.
Great to have you on, Karl. So growing up as a teenager, was it a home full of faith? Was it a home full of conversations around God? When was your first sort of like reaching out to God for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, interesting, Mark. I go backwards to that St. Mark's Tambar Springs because when people talk to me about, so how'd you become a Christian? How did faith become a part of your life? My answer is normally, let me tell you about my dad.
Right.
Because, and I'm not dodging the question, it was actually really important. My dad was German, so he grew up in Germany in the Second World War. After the Second World War, he promised his sister he would follow his sister to Australia. But keep in mind that there was no great loss for him leaving Germany. It was just traumatic and awful for him.
Wow.
And he never went back in his life. He's passed away now, but he never went back in his life. He was never interested, never spoke German at home, was just like left it all back there.
Yeah, wow.
When he came to Australia, he had no faith at all, no kind of faith experience, no faith background. The reason he was in Tambar Springs is he was sponsored out by a farmer to work on the farm, and that's why he went to Tambar Springs. You could have written what he knew about farming on the back of a postage stamp with a blunt crayon. He knew nothing about farming, but he learned, but so interesting enough. So St. Mark's Tambar Springs, in the early 60s, there was a new minister, Darrell Robinson, and Darrell Robinson was the minister who came from Moore College. So Moore College, they're in the centre of Sydney, and he decides to take St. Mark's Tambar Springs, which had never had an evangelical, gospel-minded, John Anderson tells me, leader before. And Darrell Robinson's wife was very impacted by the 1959 Billy Graham crusade.
Right.
So Darrell Robinson turns up in Tambar Springs and decides he's going to do a mission. So he invites John Turner and John Chapman to come to Tambar Springs and to run a mission. Well, everybody in town turned up to hear these city slicker preachers. What was going on? And because everybody in town turned up, my dad turned up. And he sat and my dad wrote his own life story, a reflection on his life. It's never going to be published anywhere. It was just his own reflections, and for the for family members. And he actually wrote down that after they'd had this talk, he had a conversation with John Turner, and John Turner said, "Can I pray for you?" And Dad wasn't even sure what prayer was, but he said yes. John Turner prayed for him, and his whole world changed. And he wrote that down. Everything was different. He drove home, and it was different. And the next day, he walked on the farm, and when he was walking back to the house that we lived on the farm, he wrote down in his own simple way, and the boys came up to me, which is my brother and I, we would have been aged 2 and 4. And he said it was all different, and life changed from that moment.
Wow.
He then started to do he started actually in the SEBS, the Church of England Boys Society. He was doing training with them. He was leading with them. He did some courses at Moore College. He learnt the Bible, and it just changed his whole life and changed the trajectory of our family. He wanted to be a minister. Praise God, the bishop said he shouldn't be. Because I love my dad, but he would have been a disaster as a minister and as a pastor. But the bishop did say to him, "But I do have this children's home." And my dad had some experience in social work back in Germany, and so he agreed to do it. And so he did that as a call after coming to faith as somebody probably in his late 20s, early 30s with a couple of kids. He served in that home and served those kids. I don't know how they did it. It was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
How much of that story are you getting from what you've been told and from what you observed yourself? Like, how old were you, and how much of that do you remember?
I was two.
Yeah, right.
So I don't remember him coming. I've always known my dad as a Christian.
Yeah,
it wasn't until later that I kind of heard the story.
Okay.
But he would, all the kids we would sit in one great big room around about 5 different tables, and every night he would open the Bible and read the Bible and lead a kind of study with the kids. I don't know how effective it was, but he was having a go.
Yeah.
We would always be at church every week, and so faith was just the air that we breathed, and And I remember at the entrance, just north of Sydney here, there was a mission being run, and my mum says that it was the late Alan Walker was the teacher, and we were sitting there as a family. And when they asked people to come forward, I still remember I was 11 years old. I looked at some guy just a little bit ahead of me, and I thought, even as an 11-year-old, I thought, I reckon that guy needs some help. He should go forward. and then just in this moment, there was this sense of I should go forward.
Wow.
Which I did.
Wow.
And it was my personal moment of saying, yeah, this is for me.
Wow.
And I took that seriously, even though it was it's odd, isn't it? It wasn't like, I can't remember what he said. In fact, if my mum had told me, I wouldn't even know who was speaking.
Yeah.
But it was this overwhelming sense of, no, I need to do this.
Yeah.
And even as an 11-year-old, I then started reading my Bible really regularly in the evening as much as I could. Faith became pretty serious for me. And all of us go through those teenage years where it's all a bit iffy. We're trying to be accepted at school. We're trying to be one of the cool kids, even though we're not. But it never left me, and I never gave it away, and it's always been there with me ever since.
So you said before that you weren't the most interested school kid ever, and you wanted to focus on sports. Where did you go after school? Did you jump straight into media? Did you jump into being a pastor? Like, what happened after you finished school?
Well, so I finished school, and it was one of those back in the day where nobody failed. You just got a very low mark. So I didn't get a mark that could get me into anything, anywhere basically. And I applied for a job in the bank, and the bank said, "Yeah, we'll take you as a bank employee, and you're going to Lithgow if you want to take the role." There's a role in Lithgow. I then had to look up a map to discover where Lithgow was. Lithgow is west of Sydney. For anybody listening, about you go Katoomba and keep going out, and before you get, Bathurst is further out. Lithgow is sort of between Katoomba and Bathurst. And I knew after about 3 months that working in a bank and being a teller in a bank was not my thing. And even that was a pretty interesting process. I was a kid. I was young. Like, I left home at 17, about to turn 18. I was probably immature for my age at the time. I moved 600 kilometres from where my family was. Lithgow was the sort of place where if you had any ability, you left home to go to university or college or anything. A lot of guys my age that stayed in town were working in coal mines, et cetera, et cetera. They're great people, but they just, there wasn't a lot that I could relate to there. It was a sad, lonely, difficult time, and yet it was actually a really important formative time for me. And a part of that, which is part of your question, Regan, is I just wanted to go home. I knew I didn't want to work in a bank, but for some reason I would not retire I wouldn't resign and just go home. I wasn't going to go to nothing, and which is an odd thing, isn't it? That at that age I would think that, because it would have been the easiest thing to do. And so I was applying for jobs back in Armidale. I was applying for courses back in Armidale. I was trying to do everything I could get back to Armidale. And I remember this particular night. I can't remember the date or anything, but I remember it vividly, like it was yesterday. And I'm lying in bed. All I want to do is go back to Armidale. I'm a kid that's lonely, and I had this overwhelming sense. I didn't hear a voice, but there was this overwhelming sense of, you're not going home. Look somewhere else.
Wow.
And it was, it was a night of tears. It was tough. It was, in a funny way, sort of almost a little illogical. There wasn't, some, person giving me sage advice on what I should do. It was just this sense from God that I'm not going back. And so I started looking in other directions. And I got into a social welfare course in Newcastle. And so I went to Newcastle, and I thought I might do something a bit like my parents. And in 2 years in Newcastle doing a course in social welfare, I got to the end of it with two things that I wanted to do. Work with young people, as in young, not children, but more teenagers, and work in a Christian environment. So what's important about that, it wasn't a call to sort of ministry for the rest of my life. I still didn't think I wanted to be a minister or a pastor. or a rector. I just wanted to work in a Christian environment and work with young people. So I got a job. My dad saw an ad for a job in the church scene, which is the Anglican newspaper, and it was an ad for a job in a uniting church for a youth worker. So I applied, and I still, you know what's bizarre is that there were 3 people that interviewed me for that job in this church. 2 of them, one of them, I'm on a committee with now. And I see him all the time. The other one I bump into very regularly, and they're very, very impressive people. And I went down for the interview. They gave me said, yes, we'd like you to take the role. And at the time, I thought, of course they want me to take the role. You know, what a great decision. I look back a few years ago. I look back and I thought, what were they thinking? I was 20, going on 21. I had no theological training. I had no experience in leadership. And I had, I look back now and think, I don't know what they saw, but I turned up. And I worked there for 3 years. I met and married Jane, my wife, at that church, Beecroft Uniting Church. The Uniting Church is a mixed bag, as most of us know, but this church was a very evangelically minded church, had a wonderful youth ministry. I had 3 fabulous years there. And about halfway through, I realized that I had a sense of call to do this long-term as vocational ministry. And intriguingly, it wasn't a kind of, you know, that experience I had in Lithgow at night. It wasn't this sort of, moment that God has spoken to. It was more like, I like this. I seem to be able to do it well. I'm energized by it, and I feel called to it in that sense. But then I had this little dilemma, because in Newcastle I was a part of a Baptist church, which was very significant for me as a person and my development. I'd grown up an Anglican like all my years, and the only reason I went to the Baptist church because in Newcastle it's a high church, and my mum said to me, "Oh, Carl, you might want to go to the Baptist when you go to Newcastle. You know, sort of smells and bells and incense and all of that." And but now I'm working in the Uniting Church, so you need to choose a denomination. So for a bunch of reasons, I decided to follow the Baptist denomination. Went to Morling College. Then was asked to work while I was at college at Hornsby Baptist, and while that was difficult, challenging, but wonderful. And from then on, it's just become a ministry background. And a little bit earlier, Regan, you sort of said, you know, how'd you get started in media? The intriguing thing is a lot of people talk to me because I do a lot of media, and they say, oh, you know, it's a bit like I started in media and then got into Christian ministry. Well, I'm the opposite to that. I started in Christian ministry and then drifted, as it were, moved into media ministries.
Was that a difficult decision to make? Was it hard, and did you feel a bit conflicted about moving out of that scene and moving into the media industry?
Yes and no, because what had happened was when I was in Morling College in Sydney, but a very big church in Melbourne asked if I would go to Melbourne. Long story short, they wanted me to go right away. They said, we can move you. You can finish the rest of your college in Melbourne. I spoke to the minister I was working with, and I said, this church in Melbourne has, asked me, what are you? And he's like, that's a great church. You should go. So, I thought about that quite a bit since. He was very gracious, but it's an interesting thing for me. I'd made a promise at Hornsby, and they'd been very good to me, although it was, not an easy church. And I'd made a promise that I would be there for 4 years. And under God, I just thought, I'm not going to walk away from that. I said I'll be here for 4 years. I'll stay here for 4 years. So I said to the church in Melbourne, I'm sorry, I can't come because I've said I'll be here for 4 years. And they said, we'll wait.
Wow.
So they waited 18 months. And Jane and I moved down with one 18-month-old baby and Jane, my wife, 6 months pregnant. Then we moved to Melbourne. Part of the answer to this, Rag, is I was down there for 5 years and I started to do a little bit of media in Melbourne. And then when I came back to Sydney, and I started working at Gymea Baptist Church as firstly as an associate pastor, then became the senior pastor. There's a thing that doesn't exist anymore, but it used to be called the Christian Media Association, basically in each Christian Television Association. So it's so long ago, I can't even remember. So Christian Television Association, this is probably, you probably edit this out, but let me tell you anyway. See, when television started in 1956, television was based state by state. And what the government decided is that religion would be helpful on television. So they made statutory time. So every state-based television network had to give a certain amount of time to Christian programming. Like apparently at the end of the night at 10 o'clock each night, when television stopped for the night, the last thing was a kind of Christian message. And that kind of developed. And each state had a Christian Television Association. And what they had to do was to find someone to do the programming. Now, kick forward into the 80s and 90s, the state-based were sort of still around, but it was odd because all the networks are nationalised. So, but they were still giving. So when I started at Gymea in the early 90s, the Christian Television Association in New South Wales was in touch with Channel 7 and Channel 9 and Channel 10, and they were providing programming. But this is how they provided programming. The first show I did, I was in Channel 7. You would go to Channel 7 and Channel 7 provided a full crew, and you would produce a Christian show that they would put on for free.
Unbelievable.
Absolutely remarkable. Channel 10 were doing the same. Channel 9 were doing the same. So Christian Television Association were looking for a new host. I came to Gymea. I'd done a little bit of media, and somebody said to me, Martin Johnson, who's a good friend still, said, look, the CTA are looking for a new host for this show they're doing on Channel 7. Well, do you want to do it? And I'm like, how hard can that be? So I started, and it's actually a lot harder than you think. So I started just doing these shows, and they were on statutory time. And I did those for quite a while. And then I worked with it. There's a bunch of other changes, which I won't bore you with. But I then worked on a show called Face to Face. And Face to Face was on Channel 10. It was around for a few years, and that actually got quite a bit of viewership and quite a bit of traction, and that really developed a bit of a reputation that I can do and would do media, but that all finished. I'm trying to think of a date. It was probably early 2000s. All of the channels stopped that. All the networks stopped it. And most people think it was, an ideological decision. It wasn't an ideological decision. It was more an economic decision. They'd all been bought by private equity firms. They were all losing money. They had to make $1 out of every minute. And so they cut the Christian programming. But I'd already done enough of it, and we were starting to do some stuff on our own. And in the middle of all of that, the radio station in Brisbane, 96.5, asked me if I would do some radio spots. So I started doing radio spots, and now I've done more than 1,000 of them, and the Daily Nudge is played on most stations around the country. So that's kind of, Regan, how it developed.
So you're in ministry for like 20 years in that church, right? And there came a point in time where how did you make the decision to launch out really? I presume you launched out on your own with your own media company. That must have been a huge, daunting decision to come to that.
Yeah, it was. When I was working at Gymea, and when I started, Jane and my children were, between the ages of 5 and 9, so they're young kids. And while I'd been working there, like 8-10 years in, people would say, "How long are you going to do this for, Karl? How long are you going to stay? As in, what are you thinking?" And I'd say, "Well, ever my kids are here, I'll be here." And half joking but deadly serious.
Yeah, okay.
I loved running the church that my children were at,
Okay.
and I loved creating the community that helped our family. Now, kingdom-minded, all of that.
Of
but
course.
that was important. But
Yeah.
then, Mark, when our youngest got married, and our children all got married fairly early, I remember she got married, and I was a bit like, okay, that excuse is gone.
Yeah, okay.
And there was a few things that all landed at the same time. There was a couple of things about what other staff were doing that I had been working with for many years. There was the fact that Ellie had got married, and there was a sense of, I think it's the right time. And I actually remember going for a walk down at Cronulla, which is not far off Cronulla Beaches, just
close.
8 kilometres from where we live.
Yeah.
And Jane, my wife, and I walked, just going for a walk. We didn't do that often, but we did this day. And I'd been thinking about this thought, and I'd been praying about it for a few weeks, but I hadn't talked to her about it. And we're walking along, and I said to her, you know what? I've been thinking about the whole, ministry, and I think next year might be the right time to finish up at Gymea. And she said, I think you're right.
Wow.
And that was it.
That was that.
We'd already started Olive Tree Media slightly before that, for an odd reason. There was a guy that we needed. All those radio spots were all over the shop, and we needed to have them in one place. And I'd asked a guy who ran a small foundation, because it was fairly expensive to set up the website. And he said, yeah, I can fund that. No problem. That'd be great, Karl. Anyway, he comes back to me about 2 months later. He says, oh, Karl, my foundation is set up where we can't give money to a local church, because his motivation was always, he loved the local church, was a part of it, but he wanted to fund wider ministry. And he said, and the trouble is, I've got this lawyer on my board. And the lawyer won't let me give the money to Gymea Baptist, because I was just going to kind of do it through Gymea Baptist because it was easier. And so it was a bit like either, we pass up that, or we start a small organisation.
Yeah.
So we sat around on holidays with my kids and Jane and I going, what should we call this thing? That was pretty much the beginning. So humble. And it was really just a place to house the things that we did. But once it was created, we then started to think about, what if we did some production? And so we actually produced the men's series while I was at Gymea. Then we produced a thing called the family series while I was at Gymea. And then while I was at Gymea also, we produced Towards Belief. And Towards Belief was a show that was shot around the world.
Yeah.
So I would take a holidays from Gymea. I would fly overseas for 2 weeks in filming. I'd arrive back after 2 weeks holiday.
Yeah.
And pretty much land at 6 o'clock in the morning and be at the office at 9. Nearly killed me, but it was a fabulous experience.
And that's such a good segue, because you talked about picking up the hockey stick.
Yep.
Because you wanted to travel. And your family was stuck. And it feels to me like you're picking up a video camera because you wanted to travel and you wanted to go around the world. It just feels like so much of your early years have been formative, even in what you do. And I pick up the fact that you did a whole thing on Billy Graham.
Mm-hmm.
And you did a whole research on Billy Graham, and your dad became a Christian through Billy Graham.
Yep.
So much of who you are as a person and what you've done has been formative years, and what has driven you to go out in the world and shoot some of the most amazing production that you see. And Jesus is a Game Changer, it's probably that was huge, wasn't it? Jesus is a Game Changer, and all the video production and that stuff. There's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes, I'm sure.
Yeah, look, it's really complex, and we work with great people. That's why the stuff we do is really good. And one of my things is to work out, okay, what can I do, and what do I need to let somebody else do? And it's that notion of, if you get the right people working together and each of you stays in your lane, the outcomes are astoundingly good. The problem is when people start trying to tell a cameraman how to do his job, or the director how to do their job, or the editor how to do their job. So we worked with a very good director early on, and that helped shape what we create. And it's I think what we've tried to do is shift the dial on what Christian media looks like. And Towards Belief was a part of that process. And we've continued to do that in each of the things that we've produced.
And one of the shifts is obviously in production values, which is very high. Can you tell me about a time where you're behind the mic and you're interviewing someone and it's a moment where, you know, maybe there's a bit of emotion or God's in the room, or something happens where it's almost you're not really interviewing someone anymore, you're part of what's going on, or you've just been struck by something that they've said, or what's been a moment?
That happens a fair bit, and part of the reason that happens for us is kind of how I do an interview. So most people would think the best way to do an interview is to talk to the person, meet the person, chat with the person, build rapport with the person. And after you've done that for a while, then you do an interview and you know, you get the best out of the person because you're speaking to them, et cetera, et cetera. My view is the best interview, and the best interviews I've done, I don't meet the person.
Right.
In fact, I studiously avoid talking to the person.
Right.
In fact, Jane knows that. And so Jane, when we turn up to somewhere, and if the guest that I'm going to interview is there, she does this very subtle thing where she says, go and have a coffee or do this or do that. In other words, she's not saying this out loud, but it's, you're not here to talk to Karl. Because what happens is when you're talking to somebody for the first time in an interview, you're getting the best out of the person.
Right.
The second time they tell you, or the third time they tell you,
right,
unless they're a Hollywood actor,
right,
they don't give you. It's not the same. It's not the same material. And that notion of when somebody starts to unfold their story and the kind of raw, empathetic, not empathetic, but just it's not necessarily raw emotion, but the sense that this is a real person telling what's on their heart. And we did this just recently with our newest series, Encounter, and this is the one that lives in my mind, is that we interviewed a girl called Genevieve. It's the story where she meets David Bennett in a pub. David wants to talk to her. They're chatting in a pub. And then she and David talks about this in his book, The War of the Loves. And he says they're chatting for a while. I won't go into all the details, but she prays for him, and it radically changes his life.
Right.
So I'm talking to her about why the prayer. What was she thinking? What did she pray, etc. And we're interviewing her. And I say, you know, tell me about the prayer. And she says, this is like 10 years, 15 years later. She says, I just wanted him to know that God loved him.
Mm.
And as she said it, emotion just broke through.
Right.
And the hardest thing to do when you're interviewing somebody then is to stay quiet. Don't say anything. And in the midst of that, she's obviously moved by it, but it's such a real kind of piece. We interviewed Mary Ann and Marzier. They were the two girls that were imprisoned in Tehran for being Christians, and when they tell their story. And towards the end, Marzier was talking, and I said, well, what's it like to be out? And she said, the trouble is there's still people I know that are in there. And, you know, she just tears up in the middle of it. Those are the moments you're looking for, because it's what engages people the most.
Yeah.
And it's a great privilege to be in those moments.
And I'm guessing, I know you a little bit, Karl, I'm guessing you just chase that thought. You don't have a great bunch of pre-prepared questions. You've done your research, but you're actually going in there, and whether there's something you track it down. You follow that.
You're right. Essentially, Mark, in the interviewing processes, which I've learned over the years, there's a couple of different ways of doing it. And one is that you go to the critical moment in somebody's life and you talk about it, and then you kind of backfill the information to that critical moment. The other is you sort of track through somebody's life and you know the key moments that you want them to talk about. I always have the questions on my lap. I always send the questions to the guest, and I always tell them I probably won't ask these questions. because an interview at its best is a conversation that's a real dynamic conversation.
Yeah.
And so what you're trying to do is bouncing out of what they say.
Yeah.
And the thing that most interviewers miss, two things that most interviewers miss. One is they don't listen to what the person's saying.
Yeah.
Which is the most bizarre thing, isn't it, Mark?
100%.
Imagine asking a question and then I'm not paying attention to what they're saying. The second thing about an interviewer is it's not about you.
No. No.
I've listened to some interviews. You guys would have done the same. You listen to an interview, I'm like, seriously, buddy, it's not about you.
No.
You don't have to tell the person everything that you think. Just stay quiet and just draw their story out. So if you do that, it's great.
So just to prove that I've been listening, Karl, it feels like these seminal, most important moments of your life, when you're 11, when you're called to ministry, when you're called out of Gaimea, they've all involved the voice of God. Like they've all involved God speaking to you in those really important moments.
Yeah, it is. And I think I would say two things about that. One is it's not that logic, thinking and wisdom is not involved. That would be wrong to say that that's not involved. But there's that overwhelming sense that God is speaking into your life. One of the things I didn't tell you about was at the end of my college years, and we went away for a retreat. No, I know about you, Mark. You probably love retreats, and Reagan, but retreats are not my great thing. And it gets worse. We're at this Catholic retreat centre, which is okay, and the guy leading it says, "Okay, I want you to do a visualization exercise." Now that's like saying to me, "And stick toothpicks up your fingernails." Oh no! So I thought, all right, I'll do it. So I go out and I pray and I sit down. And again, there was this sense God was saying to me, I saw myself as a elderly person, and I'd written something in a book, and I was reflecting on what I'd written, and that I'd written that during my life, I wanted to impact Australia for Jesus. Mm. And that stayed with me ever since.
That's amazing.
So everything I've done in ministry has always had that in the back of my mind. Mm. So as Mark knows, and probably not so much you, Reagan, but as Mark knows, I've done a lot of things next to running Gaimea Baptist. The Arrow program, the Jesus All About Life program, Olive Tree Media. There's all sorts of things I've been involved with. The bottom line of all of those was, how do I impact Australia for Jesus? Mm. How do I make a bigger impact than just run the local church, which is as good, as important and critical as that is. And even going into a media ministry mode and looking to do that, all of those are based around how does this impact Australia for Jesus? Mm. And I look at the end of my life, somebody else will make that decision as to where that happened. But in the back of my mind, it's always been my motivation.
Mm. No, that's so good, Karl. And I guess you're probably helping the people at home analyse our podcast now and picking apart what we're doing. But I guess one of the things you touched on as well was, not making it about you as the host and trying to draw out people's stories. I guess that's not always easy. And have there been times where, it's hard not to make it all about you, or has there been those situations? And I guess just something else to touch on as well was, have there been any other struggles since you've been in the media? Like, you've covered all these big stories, but have you copped any backlash, or how do you deal with things when they don't go your way?
Yeah, interestingly, I would, just going back to your first question, I think the times that I've had interactions with people that have been difficult, as I don't know that they've necessarily been in interviews. Most of the interviews I've done have been pretty good. I do remember doing an interview once, which was not a media one, was actually a very well-known, I won't mention his name because of what I'm about to say, a very well-known household name CEO of a massive household name company in Australia who was a Christian. And I was doing all these different panels for the Anglicans in Sydney, and they were dynamic panels, and they worked really well. But there are people like this guy who he's not letting the guard down. And it didn't matter how hard you tried, you just felt these are the pat answers. These are the right answers. And you walk away from the interview going, that was pretty boring because you never actually let the guard down a little bit. Whereas some of the other people in these interviews were just fabulous. And so that's part of trying to do an interview is to actually try and get behind the guard, get under the guard and help people share a bit more about who they are personally and individually rather than just regurgitate information that you could probably find if you Googled it now. So that's, and then I do remember a very well-known, again, I won't mention his name, internationally known speaker, and I was sitting next to him at a table and we were having a conversation. So it wasn't even just an interview, it was just a conversation. But it sticks in my mind because it was the most painful experience of my life. I mean, seriously, halfway through I was about to say, seriously, buddy, throw me a bone. This is terrible.
Wow.
I'm doing the best that I can to get something out of you, and I can't get anything out of you. So that was just terrible. But yeah, so it's an interesting art form, getting the best out of people. That second question, what was that again?
Yeah, was it hard to have humility, I guess, like being the one asking the questions and not making it about you, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, I would say probably not, because part of what we've done is a documentary style in the series that we've developed. It's sort of the style that we've developed. And so my job is not to be the expert, and this is the key thing. My job is not to be the expert. My job is to be the host and interviewer. So it's a bit like I'm taking you on a journey. So here's a problem. Who can we talk to, and how can we find out from them what's an outcome? And you'll know, anybody that's watched any of our series is a bit surprising from a Christian ministry point of view, Christian media, is that I don't come on the end and give the answers. The guest does that. So I know what my job is, Regan. I know my place. And my place is get the best out of the guest. And if I can do that and we cut it together well, it'll be absolutely beautiful. But if you make it all about yourself, it's just painful.
Just maybe, which you have not made it painful for us at all. A true professional, Karl, and I'd mean that. Just a final thought or a final question that we're interested in. It's a bit off tangent, but what's God doing right now, particularly in the world? And you and I have talked about this before, but particularly amongst young adults. Is there something different that's happening right now in the world that you're seeing?
I'd say answer that in two ways, and to say that Mark probably also knows I've done a 1-hour seminar on that, so I'm going to try and package the answer as quickly as I can. What people are seeing around the world, to quote Justin Briley's book, is a surprising rebirth in the belief in God. And it's something that nobody saw happening. If you took, and Mark and I and Regan, you might remember this, if you go back to 2006 through to 2015, the middle of the new atheist movement, it looked like the Christian church in Western democratic nations was on the back foot. And the new atheists dominated the public square. We had same-sex marriage debates. We had the Royal Commission into the institutional abuse of children. It was tough. Being a church leader in that space, talking about Jesus was hard work. And yet you've had the COVID pandemic, and then all of a sudden there's a surprising rebirth in the belief in God. And it's not just an ideological, oh, yes, this is an aspirational idea that we hope this is happening and we can see some green shoots. You've got people doing research that basically shows that between the age of 17 and 25 in England in 2018, 4% said they went to church monthly. They did the same research at the beginning of this year, and that had jumped to 16%. So fourfold increase in the number of people going to church. The churches that they're going to are the Pentecostal church and the Catholic church in England. They did research in the US, and they found that Gen Z, again, the 17 to 25-year-olds, had the lowest rate of atheism, 13%, than any other generation, and the highest rate of being very interested or somewhat interested in spiritual things, and that was at 64%. And as an example, the baby boomers sat at 35%. And in the middle of all of that, the group of people in the 17 to 25 bracket that are going to church are the blokes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And what people are seeing is that young men are just turning up the church.
Yeah.
They've been watching YouTube stuff. They've been watching Jordan Peterson.
Yeah.
They're listening to Tom Holland.
Yeah.
They're listening even to Joe Rogan. And
Yeah.
they're saying, I need to go to church.
Yeah.
And that is surprising and remarkable and a great opportunity. So you've got that going on. The other thing that's going on, which basically says what we're doing at the moment, is that young men are struggling and young men are not doing well. And there's a report that, again, this is going back to the UK. The Centre for Social Justice in the UK have just released a report. In March 2025, and it's called the Lost Boys Report. And almost at every indicator, from their home life to their education to their work to relationships, young boys are not doing great. Yeah. And it's actually a problem globally. I mean, just as a small example, do you know there's a gender pay gap for young men under 20, under 25, under 30? There's a gender pay gap. Young men earn less than young women. And that's true in the US as well. And if you go to all of the universities, they're dominated by young women.
Yeah.
And nobody's saying that young women shouldn't be doing that. The point is that we've had governments for the last 20 years focus on how do we get women into STEM subjects? How do we get more women in university? How can they do, excel? And they've done a great job. But in the process, boys have been left behind. And dating, that's another whole area. Dating and dating apps don't work for young men. And I think that's an area of great need and great opportunity.
Mate, what a fantastic time we've had, Karl, and you have been so generous with your time, but not only with your time, but just sharing out of your own story. And I, being a friend of yours for a while, being able to hear some of that stuff about your early years, I didn't know any of that, and that is super interesting. But I just want to really particularly encourage you around what your life mission has been, to see the nation of Australia come to know Jesus. That you scratch deep enough into your life, that's what you're going to find. People can find you at Olive Tree Media. I take it that's the best place for them to get to your resources and see some stuff, and I encourage people to do that. There's a bunch of materials and resources out there that people can make use of, and we do here at Cube Apps. So thanks a lot, Karl. We really appreciate your time.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks, guys.
The Audience of One podcast is hosted by Pastor Mark Edwards and Regan Smith, and is produced by the Cube Baptist Church. This episode is recorded and edited by the great Rob Hellman.